Tonight we're going back to a time you've probably never imagined drifting off to late 1940s Iran. Picture it, the air in Tehran is thick with the scent of dust and roasted nuts. The bazaars are still bustling with late-night haggling, and somewhere behind the palace walls a political gamble is brewing. You're in the middle of a country just waking up from occupation during World War II, still under Allied influence and struggling to keep its footing in a rapidly shifting global order. But here's the kicker, Iran once voted yes to the creation of the State of Israel at the United Nations. You probably won't survive this cognitive dissonance without blinking twice. It's the kind of twist that would confuse even the most die-hard Middle East policy nerd. Why would Iran, a Muslim-majority monarchy, side with a Western-backed partition plan for Palestine in 1947? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly through the autumn winds of 1947 Tehran, the city, sitting at a strange crossroads. The memory of World War II is still fresh. British and Soviet troops only left Iran a couple years ago. Reza Shah, the iron-fisted modernizer, has been exiled by the Allies since 1941, and now his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, still young and unsure, is trying to hold the country together with a mix of borrowed power and royal stubbornness. Everything smells of caution. The press is partially muzzled, clerics grumble under their breath, and the people, well, they're mostly tired of foreign boots, tired of ration lines, tired of choosing between East and West like it's a schoolyard game they didn't sign up for. Historians still debate whether the Shah had a real grip on power, or if he was just a puppet dancing to the tune of British and American oil executives. His court was glittering but fragile, full of technocrats in Western suits and generals in borrowed epaulets, and yet somehow this is the regime that would send a delegate to vote yes on one of the most contentious issues of the century. Now let's slow down and zoom out. Globally, 1947 was one of those years where history seems to hold its breath. The Cold War was just heating up, and the United Nations, still a fresh experiment in global governance, was trying to figure out what to do with the tangled mess of the British Mandate of Palestine. Jews reeling from the Holocaust were pushing for a homeland. Arabs, fearing dispossession and betrayal, were pushing back with equal desperation. The world was watching. And Iran was trying not to sneeze too loudly. They had just narrowly escaped being chopped in two during the war, thanks in part to some clever diplomacy and American pressure on the Soviets to withdraw. That memory still haunted the Iranian elite, who now understood very well how exposed their country was. One false move, and the Red Army might come dancing back over the border. So you walk through the polished halls of Tehran's foreign ministry, where meetings are held in French and tea is served with a frown. Nobody wants to talk too loudly about Palestine. Nobody wants to look too pro-Zionist or too anti-British or too anti-American. It's a tightrope act performed in Persian slippers. And in this setting, that single yes vote, given under fluorescent lights in a UN hall far from home, becomes all the more bewildering. The official records say little. The Iranian press barely covered it. And yet it happened, like a quiet footstep in a grand ballroom unnoticed by most, but echoing for decades. The vote didn't define Iran's future, but it hinted at a strange past. And tonight we begin tracing that soft echo, letting it guide us down a corridor of forgotten alliances, unexpected sympathies, and a young monarchy fumbling through international diplomacy like a child in a borrowed suit. Of course, some scholars argue it wasn't even Iran's real choice, that the decision was made under American pressure, whispered into the ears of a diplomat just hours before the vote. Others say it was strategic. Iran hoped to curry favor with the West, especially the US, which was rising as a new global hegemon, but all that is for later. Right now, in 1947, you're just walking slowly down a tiled hallway with polished floors that reflect the flickering light bulbs above, hearing the clink of teacups and the shuffle of leather shoes. You pass a portrait of the Shah looking stern and oddly distant. And you begin to understand in this world, every decision, even a single word spoken at the UN, can shape the trajectory of entire nations. You're already deep into this story, but the strangest parts are yet to come. For example, did you know that Iran had one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world, stretching back over 2,500 years, or that the same country which once helped rebuild Solomon's temple would one day chant for its destruction in street protests? Sleep on that. You keep walking, but the tiled hallway in your mind slowly morphs into a wider street, one bordered by Tehran's tall plane trees, their golden leaves crunching gently underfoot. The year remains 1947, but the mood shifts slightly. You're now drifting through the upper neighborhoods of the city where embassies stand behind iron gates and couriers deliver telegrams with tense foreheads. This is the playground of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the young monarch who now must shoulder his father's iron legacy while appearing far less iron. He's barely in his late 20s, handsome, soft-spoken, often underestimated. Mohammad Reza has inherited a throne, but not the full command that came with it. His father, Reza Shah, had ruled like a Persian bulldozer, centralizing power, modernizing, by force bullying the clergy and banning the veil. But the Allies, suspecting his Axis sympathies, forced him to abdicate during World War II. So now the son sits on the peacock throne, trying to project the strength of his father while maintaining the charm demanded by his British and American minders. Historians still argue whether Mohammad Reza was truly in charge during these years, or just acting out the polite theatre of a sovereign. Either way, he was walking a tightrope stretched between superpowers, while behind him, Iran's deeply conservative clerics muttered under their breath, and Marxist students passed pamphlets under university desks. He had reason to be careful. His realm was fragile, stitched together with oil profits and foreign loans. The countryside was restless. The tribal areas, though recently subdued, still bristled at central control. And Tehran, though glittering on the surface, was a capital city full of listening ears. Every action had a consequence. Every word spoken in public echoed back with interest. You sit with the Shah in his study, a quiet room panelled with wood, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the faint smell of old paper. He's flipping through cables from Washington, Moscow, and London, each one more opaque than the last. His advisors buzz in and out like bees, some trained in Paris, others in Cairo, all with different loyalties. A young CIA operative just might be lurking 2 floors below, sipping sweet black tea and sketching out a memo on regional instability. The Shah knows that neutrality is a myth. If Iran stands too close to the Soviets, the Americans will punish it. If it leans too hard toward the West, domestic radicals might ignite the streets. So like a cautious dancer at a royal ball, the Shah chooses his steps with care. And when word comes that the UN will soon vote on the future of Palestine, you can imagine the collective groan within the palace walls. This is exactly the kind of issue no one in Iran wants to touch. But touch it they must, because this is not just about Jews and Arabs. This is about alignment, about which direction the Shah's Iran will lean in this newborn Cold War. Behind closed doors, some advisors argue for abstention. Others suggest a quiet no vote, something that would please the Arab League and avoid public anger from Iran's conservative base. But one or two whisper something braver. Perhaps a yes vote could buy favor from the Americans, who were increasingly interested in Iran's strategic position and its vast oil reserves. The Americans were also leading voices in support of the Jewish homeland. So despite the risk, the possibility of a yes is floated. Not confirmed, not celebrated, just floated like a note tucked into a coat pocket. You wonder if the Shah truly believed in the cause. There's little evidence he did. But politics is rarely about belief, it's about leverage. And the idea of earning points with Washington while angering neither Moscow nor the clerics was tempting, if incredibly tricky. Here's a fringe tidbit that rarely makes the textbooks around this time. The Iranian government quietly consulted with leaders of the country's Jewish community. They asked, without asking, what their thoughts were. Most Iranian Jews supported the idea of a Jewish homeland, of course, but they were terrified of backlash. Don't make us a symbol, one elder is rumoured to have said, "Let us be Iranian first." Iranian Jews who'd lived in Persia since before the fall of Babylon were navigating the same tightrope as their king. They prayed in Persian-accented Hebrew, ran carpet shops and pharmacies, and sent their kids to both religious schools and secular universities. They were proud to be both Jewish and Iranian and desperately wanted to stay that way. Still, those ancient ties mattered. Iran had long enjoyed a unique relationship with its Jewish population. Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who conquered Babylon in the 6th century BCE, famously allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. That act of generosity is still recited in Jewish prayers and Zionist histories. In fact, modern Israeli coins once bore Cyrus's name. So when the Shah's inner circle sat around that polished table mulling over how to vote, someone inevitably invoked history. Cyrus helped them once the argument went. Perhaps his descendants should again. Was it genuine conviction, or just a poetic cover for realpolitik historians still puzzle over that? You close your eyes and imagine that smoky room full of murmured arguments and unspoken fears. The Shah sits still, a finger tapping on the armrest of his chair. His country is poor, vulnerable, and surrounded by louder voices. But this vote, it might just help him buy a little influence, a little protection, or it might backfire entirely. You lean against the cool marble of the United Nations lobby, well, not literally, of course. But in your dreamlike drift through 1947, that's where you find yourself next. Lake Success, New York. A name that sounds almost too on the nose for a place where global ambitions come to be judged. It's late November, and the mood is electric, the kind of tension that makes even seasoned diplomats fidget with their lapel pins. Inside the General Assembly Hall, the ceilings are high, the chairs are stiff, and the world's newly minted bureaucrats bustle about like ants, carrying ideological sugar cubes. You hear snippets of Spanish, French, Russian, Arabic, and English. Typewriters click pages, shuffle, and translators' voices float through the earpieces like calming waves in a sea of chaos. The subject is Palestine, again. The British, having managed the territory under the League of Nations mandate since 1920, have washed their imperial hands of the whole thing. After years of bloodshed, rebellion, and failed diplomacy, they've asked the United Nations to take over and figure it out. Classic British Empire move: exit quietly, leave a mess. And so the UN Special Committee on Palestine has proposed a bold plan: partition. Divide the land into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem as an international zone. It's a compromise which in diplomacy means everyone hates it just enough to consider it. Historians still argue whether this plan was an act of idealism or pure desperation. But no matter. The vote is scheduled for November 29th, and delegations from around the world have gathered, some with clear instructions, others fumbling in the fog of last-minute diplomacy. And there sits Iran's delegation, low-profile, tidy, impeccably polite. They're not part of the Security Council, they're not leading debates, but they are there, and their single vote holds weight. This is the General Assembly, after all, where every member state counts equally. Iran's representatives, mainly career diplomats trained in the old Persian mold of poise and ambiguity, have not made any public statement. They've avoided the microphones, kept to their seats, and met mostly in whispers. You wonder whether they even want to be here. And perhaps they don't. There's pressure from the Arab bloc, of course. Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Saudi Arabia are all firmly against the plan. They see it as a colonial reslicing of Arab lands. The Arab League is watching closely, and Iran, though not Arab, is still a Muslim majority state. Voting yes would not be popular. But there's pressure from elsewhere too. The United States in particular is lobbying hard. American officials make quiet rounds offering subtle incentives or maybe just veiled suggestions. After all, the US sees Israel as a potential ally in a volatile region. The Cold War is already percolating, and any new state could become a pawn or a partner. You picture a sleepless Iranian delegate in a modest New York hotel room the night before the vote. The radiator clicks, the curtains flutter slightly, the city hums far beyond the glass. He's reviewing his telegrams, some from Tehran, some from Washington. One of them might say vote yes, another might say avoid headlines. Most just say don't mess this up. Here's the quirky bit: the Iranian delegation may have initially intended to abstain. That was the safer route. But at the last minute, somewhere between a coffee break and a closed-door meeting, the instruction changed. Iran would vote yes. And so the roll call begins. One by one, the names are read. The hall is silent except for the clear voices echoing through the chamber. Afghanistan, number Argentina, yes. Australia, yes. On and on it goes.
Iran.
You hold your breath. The delegate leans forward. There's no drum roll, no dramatic pause, just a simple, measured reply. Yes. A few eyebrows lift. Murmurs ripple through the room. It's not a shock exactly, but it's not what most expected. Iran has just aligned itself with the Western Bloc in a vote that will reshape the Middle East. The final tally, 33 in favor, 13 against 10 abstentions. The resolution passes. Historians still speculate why Iran voted yes. Was it a nod to its ancient friendship with Jews, a strategic move to cozy up to the Americans, a momentary lapse in communication? Some say the Shah wanted favor with Washington ahead of anticipated military aid. Others whisper that the US leaned hard in those final hours. Whatever the cause, the vote is cast. The record is sealed. Iran has spoken softly, without fanfare, but clearly. Back home, no one quite knows what to make of it. The Iranian press is restrained, cautious. Religious leaders aren't thrilled. Nationalists are confused. And the Jewish community, they feel a strange mix of relief and fear. Yes was what they hoped for, but it's also a spotlight they didn't ask to stand under. You drift back to the hall, now emptying. Papers gather in little piles on the desks. Delegates shake hands stiffly or rush off to write reports. The Iranian seat is already vacant, its occupant gone to debrief in quiet corners. The world doesn't change overnight, but a stone has been dropped into the pond and the ripples are already moving outward. And you're just floating there, watching history pivot on a single word spoken in perfect diplomatic monotone. You drift now into a quieter courtyard shaded by tall trees where the dust settles gently on stone tiles and the air smells faintly of pomegranates and worn paper. This is not a place of kings or clerics, but of books and conversations. Here in 1940s Tehran, intellectual salons flicker with ideas, and among the clinking of teacups a curious question is being passed around like a pipe. Should Jews have a homeland? It may surprise you, but in those dimly lit rooms where poets quoted Hafez and students argued over Kant, there were Iranians who supported Zionism. Not secretly, not with fireworks either, but with a quiet confidence born from books and memory. Among them were Jewish intellectuals, of course, but also a few Muslim thinkers who saw the idea through a different lens, not religious, not even always political, but human. One of the most fascinating corners of this time is the small but persistent pro-Zionist sentiment within parts of Iran's Jewish community. You picture a modest printing press in the backstreets of Tehran spitting out newsletters with Hebrew headlines and Persian footnotes. There's excitement in the air, tentative, careful excitement. Groups like Anjuman-e Tehran, the Tehran Jewish Association, held discussions about Palestine, collected donations and organized cultural events to keep the spirit of connection alive. But here's the thing, it wasn't only about Zionism, it was also about survival. In post-war Iran, Jewish identity was not something people advertised carelessly. Most Jews were fiercely loyal to Iran and sought to avoid being painted as outsiders. They worked in trade medicine, law and education. They spoke Persian, fluently followed Iranian customs, and knew the terrain of diplomacy better than most. Still behind closed doors, many dreamed of Israel, not necessarily to emigrate there, but because it meant something. It meant dignity, it meant safety, and it meant that for once, Jews would not have to beg kings or parliaments to be left alone. Historians still argue whether these Jewish community leaders influenced Iran's vote at the UN. Some say they had no real access to the Shah's court. Others claim back channels existed in formal conversations with ministers, ambassadors, even royal advisors. Perhaps a respected Jewish businessman dropped a line to someone over tea. Perhaps an emissary mentioned a promise made by America in exchange for a favorable vote. The trail is foggy as all such trails tend to be. You find yourself in the middle of one such hypothetical conversation now. Picture a refined living room in North Tehran, velvet chairs, a samovar, hissing quietly a record, playing faintly in the corner. A Jewish academic leans forward and says, "This vote, it's not about Jews alone, it's about where Iran stands in the world." Across from him, a Muslim professor nods slowly, and where it will be standing tomorrow. That's the part many forget. 1947, Iran was still trying to define itself. Reza Shah had yanked the country into modernity with railroads, forced education reforms, and a ban on the veil. His son inherited the form, but not the confidence. The state wasn't quite secular, wasn't quite theocratic, and wasn't quite democratic either. It was a little bit of everything, like a poorly shuffled deck. So when the question of Palestine reached Tehran's thinking class, the answers were just as mixed. There were passionate defenses of Arab sovereignty, fiery essays about colonialism, and yes, cautiously hopeful writings about the Jewish dream. A Persian newspaper might print a piece denouncing Zionism, and 3 pages later, a letter praising Cyrus the Great for his role in Jewish liberation. In one particularly fringe but fascinating anecdote, a Jewish Iranian school in Tehran hosted a poetry recital in late 1947 featuring Hebrew and Persian verses honoring peace, nationhood, and survival. A few Muslim parents reportedly attended, moved by the words but also nervous about the politics. Afterward, they said nothing publicly, but they remembered. Memory was a currency in Iran, after all. You drift back outside where a cold breeze cuts through the afternoon sun. Along the city's alleys, murals fade on brick walls, slogans half erased. You pass by a small bookstore where pamphlets in French, Arabic, and Persian compete for shelf space. A thin booklet catches your eye, Palestine and Justice, a Persian View. It's worn dog-eared. Inside, an essay argues for peaceful coexistence. Partition, the writer says, may be unjust. But what has been just in this world since the Romans fell? That's Iran for you. A land where contradictions bloom like jasmine, where the same street can host a revolutionary sermon and a Bach recital within hours. And amid these contradictions, there existed a sliver of Iranian society that saw in the Jewish cause something familiar, the longing for self-determination, the ache for security, the hope that maybe, just maybe, history could offer a do-over. You're not looking at a country united in support, far from it, but you are looking at a country layered with nuance where yes could mean many things: strategic, symbolic, sentimental. And somewhere in that tangle, Zionism found unexpected allies in bookstores, in classrooms, in living rooms filled with fading light and ambitious dreams. You're drifting now toward the northern borderlands where mountains rise like silent sentinels and the air grows sharper with every step. It's not just the cold you feel, it's the chill of a larger presence watching from beyond. Because looming just north of Iran, casting a shadow over all diplomatic calculations of the late 1940s, is the Soviet Union. Vast, unpredictable, and only recently persuaded to pull its tanks away from Iranian soil. You remember that just a couple of years earlier in 1946, Soviet troops had refused to leave northern Iran after World War II ended. They lingered under the pretense of protecting supply lines, but were really hoping to squeeze Iran for oil concessions and maybe even break off the province of Azerbaijan as a puppet state. That's not the kind of thing you forget quickly, especially not if you're the Shah, trying to sleep at night with a world war behind you, and a cold one just starting to hiss. Historians still debate whether Stalin ever truly intended to annex part of Iran, or merely bluff the Allies for leverage. Either way, Tehran didn't see it as a bluff. The government scrambled. US pressure and a flurry of diplomatic panic finally got the Soviets to back down, but that scar didn't heal. It festered. It became the central anxiety of Iranian foreign policy for years to come. How do we avoid becoming the next Poland or Korea? You're sitting now in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, building tall ceilings, the smell of ink and cigarette smoke heavy in the air. A group of weary officials hunches around a long mahogany table. Someone unfolds a world map, its edges frayed from overuse. A diplomat traces a finger from Moscow to Baku to Tabriz and sighs deeply. Another points west to the Mediterranean. Palestine, he says quietly. The Americans want something from us. This is where the Soviet factor complicates the simple narrative of Iran's vote. On the surface, Iran supporting the UN partition plan looks like a move toward the West. And it is, but not necessarily out of friendship. Sometimes survival wears the mask of diplomacy. Iran had to signal to Washington that it was a reliable partner, that it could be counted on, that it wasn't drifting into Moscow's orbit. So when the Americans began quietly pushing for votes in favor of partition, Iran listened, not because it loved the idea, but because it couldn't afford to alienate its most powerful potential ally. Here's a curious detail. The Soviet Union itself also voted yes for the UN partition plan. Yes, the Soviets, despite their later opposition to Israel, initially supported its creation. Stalin likely saw a future Jewish state as a way to weaken British influence in the Middle East, and possibly sow future instability among pro-Western Arab regimes. A classic move in Cold War chess. So imagine how strange this moment is. Iran, a monarchy terrified of Soviet aggression, casts the same vote as the USSR and the United States, two giants who will soon be locking horns over everything from Berlin to nuclear weapons. Iran isn't joining sides here, it's doing a diplomatic shimmy trying to stay in the game without getting crushed by the board. You sit with a mid-level Iranian official later that evening. He's drinking tea, his tie, loosened his eyes, tired. We voted, yes, he says more to himself than to you, but we voted scared. Because fear was the undercurrent of every major decision in Iranian foreign policy back then. Fear of partition, not of Palestine, but of Iran. Fear of Moscow's long reach. Fear of becoming a forgotten pawn in someone else's strategy. There's a fringe anecdote that floated through diplomatic circles. In later years, supposedly an Iranian delegate once joked after the vote, "If both Stalin and Truman like the plan, who are we to say no?" The quote may be apocryphal, but the sentiment reflects the dilemma Iran faced, trapped between empires trying to keep its sovereignty intact, with small strategic nods. You walk the streets of Tabriz now imagining what it felt like in those tense days when Soviet flags flew briefly over buildings and rumors of secession whispered through the markets. The people here hadn't forgotten, and neither had Tehran. So if saying yes to a UN vote brought a little goodwill from Washington, then perhaps it was worth it, even if the Shah himself barely said a word about it in public. Historians still can't agree whether Iran's vote was directed by the palace, the foreign ministry, or simply shaped by international pressure. The cables sent between Tehran and New York are maddeningly vague. There's no dramatic order that says, vote yes. But there is an unmistakable signal: do not provoke the Americans. Do not make Iran look unstable. Do not side with the Soviets even by silence. So here you are perched between paranoia and pragmatism, between Stalin's moustache and Truman's grin. Iran, a land of poets and empire, reduced to balancing a teacup on a trembling finger. Every drop matters. One spill and the consequences might not be diplomatic, they could be existential. And in that fragile calculus, Palestine was never just about Palestine. It was about showing the world that Iran could participate in global decisions, even if doing so felt like walking a tightrope in the dark. Now the wind changes direction and you follow it, not through marble corridors or mountain valleys this time, but towards something far less poetic and far more greasy. Oil. The black lifeblood of empires, the sticky glue holding alliances together. The reason diplomats speak in riddles and monarchs get invited to tea in London. It's 1947 and Iran's relationship with oil is as complicated as a Farsi poem, rhythmic, powerful and often tragic. At the center of it all is the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later known as British Petroleum. You can picture it a sprawling industrial operation in Abadan, its chimneys rising like middle fingers to Iranian sovereignty. The company pumps oil out of Iranian soil and sends profits straight to British shareholders, leaving Iran with scraps and resentment. Historians still debate just how much money Iran lost during those years, but let's just say it wasn't enough to build schools, hospitals, or a modern army. What it did buy was influence. British influence poured liberally across Iranian politics, media, and security forces. So where does Israel come into this? You're probably wondering how a dusty corner of the eastern Mediterranean could possibly matter to Persian oil executives and imperial admirals. Well, it's not about geography, it's about alignment. By 1947, Britain was trying desperately to untangle itself from the Palestinian Mandate, worn down by Jewish militias, Arab revolts, and a public that no longer had the stomach for overseas entanglements. Meanwhile, the Americans were stepping up, eager to fill that vacuum and project power across the oil-rich Middle East. Iran watched all this with more than casual interest, because if Britain was pulling back and the United States was moving in, Tehran needed to be on the guest list for this new geopolitical dinner party. Voting yes on the Palestine partition plan wasn't just about Israel, it was about saying, hey Washington, we're with you now, sort of. You're walking now through the corridors of the Iranian oil ministry, dusty filing cabinets, worn leather chairs and portraits of monarchs watching silently from the walls. In one office, a deputy minister is reviewing British telegrams. In another, someone's writing a polite note to the American ambassador, expressing Iran's hope for continued technical collaboration and mutual understanding. And in the margins of those letters, the word Palestine appears. Not prominently, but there. A side comment, a signal. We support responsible steps toward peace and stability in the region. One memo reads, "That's diplomatic code for we just voted. Yes, don't forget it later when we ask for equipment and investment." Here's a quirky little footnote. In 1947, an informal lunch was held at the American embassy in Tehran, where a few Iranian officials, a couple of oil advisors, and a US attaché supposedly discussed regional realignments. According to one second-hand account, someone joked, "We voted with our noses closed." Everyone laughed. No one wrote it down. But the sentiment was clear. Iran's yes vote wasn't about embracing Zionism or rejecting Arab neighbors. It was about oil, specifically about securing favor with the side that could protect Iran's reserves and perhaps renegotiate those awful British contracts someday. Of course, this didn't sit well with everyone. The Arab League quickly took notice. Iran wasn't an Arab country, but it was a Muslim-majority one, and the Arab public, stoked by fiery radio broadcasts from Cairo and Damascus, began viewing Iran with suspicion. Protests erupted in some Arab capitals. Iranian diplomats found themselves side-eyed at regional conferences. And back home, the clergy noticed too. Conservative voices in Qom began muttering that the Shah was selling out the Muslim world. A few newspaper editorials, carefully worded of course, wondered whether Iran had forgotten its Islamic solidarity. But in the palace, the vote was filed away with a shrug. It had served its purpose. No one in the Shah's court wanted to make a fuss about it. There was no parade, no speech, not even a press release. Just a quiet nod and a hopeful glance toward Washington. Historians still argue whether the vote ever really paid off. Did Iran get any special favor? Was it rewarded with oil contracts, military aid, or diplomatic hugs? Maybe, maybe not. American support for Iran would grow in the years to come, but that may have had more to do with Soviet containment than any polite vote at the UN. Still, you have to admire the elegance of it. One yes, cast in a faraway room, potentially earning Iran a seat at the grown-ups' table. It was foreign policy with a wink and a risk. And if you walk through the streets of Abadan now in this drifting memory of 1947, you'll see why that mattered. The oil fields smell like sulfur and sweat. Workers labor under the desert sun while British engineers sip cold drinks in shaded offices. Iranian nationalists grind their teeth. Everyone knows the system is broken, but no one yet knows how to fix it. The vote on Israel didn't change that. But it gave Iran something else, an illusion of agency, a moment of participation, a signal that maybe, just maybe, it could play the game rather than just be played. You're back on a plane now, its engine humming steadily beneath you, its windows framing clouds like brushed cotton. Inside, the air is thick with cologne and cigarette smoke, and the Iranian delegation is strapped into their seats, flying westward across the Atlantic toward New York. It's late 1947 and the vote hasn't happened yet, but the pressure is mounting. The conversations on board are hushed, deliberate, and anxious. You're seated next to a young Iranian diplomat. Let's call him Mr. K. His hair is slicked back, his French is perfect, and his shoes are polished within an inch of their lives. He doesn't know it yet, but within days, he'll cast a vote that no one back home will quite understand and that many people abroad will never forget. The delegation was small. Iran didn't send an army of policy wonks or media handlers. It was just a handful of men in tailored suits carrying briefcases full of official documents and unofficial doubts. They flew commercial, not in grand style, and they weren't particularly high-ranking. At the time, Iran's diplomatic corps was composed mostly of career officials, men trained to be discreet, composed, and as non-committal as humanly possible. Historians still debate whether the final voting instructions were issued before they left Tehran or after they arrived in New York. There are suggestions that the original plan was to abstain, an easy way to avoid offending anyone, the diplomatic equivalent of shrugging your shoulders with impeccable posture. But somewhere along the way, the signal changed. You imagine Mr. K receiving a confidential cable from Tehran after midnight in his modest hotel room? The radiator clangs faintly. A cockroach scuttles across the windowsill. The message is brief, probably coded, but its meaning is clear vote, yes. No explanation, no footnote. Just a firm nudge in a particular direction. It's a peculiar feeling, isn't it? To represent a country of millions, but not to know exactly why your finger is hovering over yes. To realize that your action will echo through decades, and yet your instructions came in a single sentence from someone whose face you might never see again. Iran's delegation wasn't alone in its uncertainty. Several countries arrived at the vote with ambiguous guidance, flexible orders, or downright confusion. The US and its allies were scrambling behind the scenes, offering subtle promises and applying just enough pressure to avoid leaving fingerprints. One member of the Iranian mission allegedly confided to a colleague from another delegation, "We are here to listen, not to lead." And yet when your name is called during a UN roll call, you must do something. You must choose a side even if you don't fully understand the consequences. Now you're walking with Mr. K and his colleagues as they approach the UN building in Lake Success. Its windy leaves scattering across the wide steps. Inside, the atmosphere is tense. Not dramatic, but the kind of tension that makes neckties feel a little too tight. Everyone knows that the vote will change the world map. No one knows exactly how. The Iranian seat is not front and center. It's off to the side near the other so-called middle powers, the countries too small to lead, too proud to follow. Delegates sit behind their country's nameplates, scribbling notes, listening to translators. Outside the chamber, US officials are quietly checking in. How are you voting? We hope we can count on your support. The kind of diplomatic sentences that sound bland, but hit like bricks when the stakes are high. There's a fringe account, unverified but deliciously possible, that one Iranian delegate muttered to himself before the vote, "If only we were voting on carpets." It's a line that captures the absurdity of the situation. A Persian official being asked to reshape the Levant with a single word, when what he really knows best is protocol poetry and not making enemies. Still, when Iran's name is called, the response is immediate yes. No hesitation, no explanation, just a clean entry into the record. And then it's done. The papers are gathered, the vote is passed, the Jewish state will be born. The Arab states storm out of the chamber. Journalists rush to file stories. But the Iranian delegation, they quietly return to their hotel. No press conference, no public statements, just a few nods, some soft-spoken reflections, and perhaps a drink. Historians still argue whether Iran's vote was a strategic success or a diplomatic blunder. Some claim it brought goodwill from the US. Others say it alienated Arab neighbors without delivering any real rewards. But from the perspective of the men on that plane on that day, it probably felt like nothing more than one more cautious step in a minefield. Back on the return flight, Mr. K stares out the window. New York recedes into mist. He doesn't feel triumphant. He doesn't feel ashamed either. Mostly he feels tired. He wonders if anyone in Tehran will remember this moment. or if, like so many things in Iranian foreign policy, it will be buried under the next wave of urgency. You float beside him in that cabin, hearing only the drone of the engine and the quiet clicking of his pen. He writes something in a small notebook, maybe a personal reflection, maybe a report for the archives. We'll never know. That notebook is probably locked in a forgotten drawer now, its pages yellowing, its author long gone. But the vote, that one word yes, still echoes. Now the calendar ticks forward just slightly. The vote is cast, the ink has dried, and you're back in Tehran, where the streets hum with quiet confusion. No parades, no banners, no public applause. Just the usual rhythms of post-war life. The trolley rattling past Sadabad Palace students, heading to university vendors, calling out prices in the bazaar. On the surface, everything looks unchanged, but beneath that there's a tension, not loud, not yet, but palpable, in the way certain people lower their voices or how newspapers run columns heavy with subtext. Iran had voted yes, and now the country was figuring out how to live with it. The first ripples came from abroad. The Arab press took notice fast and loud. Cairo's radio broadcasts were particularly sharp, accusing Iran of betraying Muslim unity. In Damascus and Baghdad, editorials appeared condemning Tehran's choice as short-sighted and pro-imperialist. Embassies in Arab capitals sent clipped formal complaints. The Arab League made its displeasure known not in war declarations, but in pointed diplomatic frost. Back in Iran, the political class didn't rush to justify the vote. In fact, they mostly avoided talking about it at all. The Shah made no public remarks. The Foreign Ministry didn't release a statement. There was no grand defense of the decision, no elaborate explanation, just silence. A tactic Iranians have mastered over centuries: when in doubt, disappear into ambiguity. Historians still argue whether this post-vote silence was strategic or a sign of disarray. Some say the Shah wanted to minimize backlash by pretending nothing unusual had happened. Others believe that even he was unsure what his government had actually gained from the vote. Meanwhile, inside Iran's religious circles, the murmurs began. The clerics, especially in cities like Qom and Mashhad, were not amused. They had tolerated Reza Shah's forced secularization with gritted teeth. They were keeping a wary eye on his son. And now this A vote, supporting a Jewish state in Muslim land, you're sitting cross-legged on a faded rug in a small madrasa courtyard, where a bearded scholar quietly lectures his students on the concept of Ummah, the global Muslim community. His voice is calm, but his words cut deep. When one limb of the body is in pain, he says, quoting a hadith, the whole body aches. No names are mentioned, but the message is clear. The Iranian press, under tight censorship, handled the story with kid gloves. Most newspapers either avoided mentioning the vote at all or buried it in back-page columns behind farm reports and weather updates. One newspaper cautiously published a summary of the UN's decision, but added that Iran wishes peace and justice for all people of the region. A sentence so bland you could spread it on toast. There's a quirky little anecdote from this period. One Tehran newspaper printed a cartoon of the globe looking worriedly at the Middle East, with Iran portrayed as a guy nervously holding a match near a gasoline barrel labeled Palestine. The cartoon lasted in circulation for about 12 hours before it was pulled, and the editor went on vacation. Among Iran's Jewish community, reactions were more complex. On one hand, the yes vote was quietly celebrated. In synagogues from Shiraz to Isfahan, prayers were whispered with more fervor. A few families lit candles not just for the Sabbath, but for the dream of a homeland finally declared legitimate. But there was also fear. The spotlight, even a favorable one, could be dangerous. They had lived for centuries in Iran by keeping their heads down and their doors open. Now, with Palestine aflame and Arab leaders calling for jihad, even sympathy could be seen as sedition. One Jewish elder in Tehran reportedly told his children, "Tonight we will pray, but tomorrow we speak of other things." Iran's government, seeing the rumblings, moved quickly but not openly. There were quiet assurances given to neighboring Arab ambassadors, polite conversations about technicalities and diplomatic nuance. Behind the curtain, Iran was already shifting its tone. The yes had been given, but its echo could be softened. Historians still scratch their heads at how rapidly Iran walked back its enthusiasm. Within months, Iranian officials began expressing deep concern over the growing violence in Palestine. Tehran's UN delegation grew cool toward discussions involving the new Jewish state. No formal recognition was issued, no embassy was planned. Iran had said yes once, but never repeated it. You're back now in a cabinet meeting with sunlight filtering through the blinds and voices low. One minister, barely audible, says we should not make enemies without knowing who our friends truly are. Another taps his pen, and we've made enemies. Heads nod, not in outrage, just weary acceptance. The Shah, ever cautious, said nothing publicly. He had no interest in alienating the clerics or stirring protests, but neither did he regret the vote entirely. Some say he believed naively or optimistically that Iran's small gesture would win quiet favors from Washington. Others say he was simply looking to stay relevant in an increasingly bipolar world. You walk through the streets of Tehran one evening, and you notice something subtle. The walls are still painted with old slogans from the war years praising unity and sovereignty. But new ones are being scribbled over them, messier, more urgent. You pass a kiosk where a newspaper headline reads, UN faces crisis over Palestine violence. No mention of Iran, just the suggestion that everything's gotten messy and that perhaps silence is the best response. And maybe that's what defines this chapter of the story. Not the vote itself, but the silence that followed. The way Iran tried to backpedal without falling, to gesture without speaking, to nod once, and then pretend it didn't happen. A nation whispering its way through history, hoping the echo wouldn't come back too loud. You're still in Tehran, but the colors have dimmed. The city now walks with more caution, like someone who just realized they've said the wrong thing at a dinner party full of diplomats. Outside the foreign ministry, the lamps flicker against the tiled facade. Inside, the mood is brittle. Iran's government knows it stepped into a conversation that might never end, and now they have to live with the consequences of a single, powerful word, yes. So the question rises quietly like steam from a tea kettle. What did Iran hope to gain? Because this was not a sentimental yes. It wasn't born out of idealism or a grandstand speech about human rights. There were no flowery declarations, no Shah-approved radio broadcasts praising the rebirth of Israel. Instead, it was a tight-lipped nod that happened somewhere between geopolitical pragmatism and diplomatic poker. The obvious theory, Iran voted yes to curry favor with the United States. America was emerging fast, no longer just one superpower among many, but the superpower. And Iran, feeling encircled by the Soviet Union to the north and uncertain Arab loyalties to the west, wanted to be on Washington's good side. The Americans had military equipment, they had money, and they were the ones who had strong-armed the Soviets into withdrawing from Iranian Azerbaijan just the year before. That kind of leverage doesn't go unnoticed. Historians still argue whether Iran expected any immediate return on that yes vote. Military aid, favorable trade terms, oil infrastructure, help something tangible. Some internal memos suggest the Shah's ministers believed the vote would improve strategic rapport with the West. Others hint it was more of a gesture, an attempt to play nice in a Cold War that hadn't yet fully ripened. But here's where it gets more interesting. Iran might have also seen the vote as a message to Britain, a subtle jab at its former colonial handler. Remember, Britain was trying to wash its hands of Palestine. The empire was retreating. The sun was finally setting. And while the British had once held Iran's economy army and even its oil fields in a chokehold by 1947, they were slowly losing their grip. By voting yes, Iran may have been signaling that it was ready to think beyond the empire, ready to rebrand. Not as a British puppet, not as a Soviet satellite, but as a middle power that could engage with the post-colonial world on new terms. Then there's the possibility of miscalculation. You're sitting now in a modest ministry office, dusty bookshelves, an ashtray full of half-smoked gauloises, a weary bureaucrat thumbing through telegrams. We thought it wouldn't matter, he says flatly. Just one vote among many. A procedural moment. The idea being that no one would pay much attention to Iran's stance, that abstaining or saying yes would amount to the same thing in the tidal wave of global opinion. But, of course, it did matter. Every vote was counted. Every yes or no carried symbolic weight far beyond its individual force. And when Iran's support joined the chorus that legitimized the partition, it was noticed by Arabs, by clerics, by Zionists, by history itself. Here's a fringe theory that floats around in the more conspiratorial corners of diplomatic law, that Iran was gently nudged toward its vote by whispers from American oil executives. Not in a smoky room with a briefcase full of cash, no, that's too cinematic, but in casual conversations, in winks and nudges, in phrases like long-term partnership and regional energy security. The kind of talk that makes you feel important without ever being written down. We may never know for sure. But we do know this Iran's yes was one of only a few from Muslim-majority nations. Most others voted no or abstained. And that distinction made Iran visible, just visible enough to spark questions, but not strong enough to control the narrative. You walk the halls of Tehran University now, where students read newspapers in dim light, and professors debate behind closed doors. One history teacher scrawls the words strategic ambiguity on a chalkboard and underlines them twice. That's what we are, now he says, not Western, not Eastern, just unsure. Iran wanted to appear cooperative, sophisticated, a participant in the shaping of the new world, but it also wanted to stay out of trouble. That's not an easy balance to maintain, and the aftermath of the vote revealed how slippery it could be, because after the vote Iran gained... what exactly? There were no immediate American airlifts full of gold bars, no oil concessions were renegotiated overnight. Washington said thank you, of course, in the quiet language of diplomacy, but within weeks Iran was back to dealing with its usual headaches: domestic unrest, foreign manipulation, economic troubles, and a monarchy increasingly unsure of its public image. And still the vote lingered, like the smell of kerosene on your clothes after you leave the refinery. Historians still discuss whether the Shah believed the move had paid off in the long run. Some argue it opened the first door to closer American-Iranian relations, paving the way for military aid in the 1950s and the deep, if fraught, alliance that would later define the Cold War years. Others say it was a forgettable gesture lost in the shuffle of louder policies and more explosive events. But for a moment, one brief, quiet moment, Iran had raised its voice in a global forum, and the world had listened. Maybe not applauded, maybe not praised, but listened. You return now to the small hotel room where Iran's delegation had once huddled over crumpled notes and coded telegrams. The room is empty. The curtains stir with an unseen breeze. On the desk, a forgotten teacup has left a pale ring on the wood. That perhaps is the shape of Iran's yes. Not a drumbeat, not a cheer, but a faint circular echo. Soft, complicated, and unforgettable if you know where to look. And now you're flipping through faded memoirs and dusty interviews, leaning close over forgotten pages, as if each whisper from the past might offer clarity. Because when official records fall silent, and they do often, it's the diplomats themselves who sometimes tell the rest of the story years later, after retirement, after the headlines have faded, after the consequences are known. Iran's vote, as surprising as it may seem today, didn't spring fully formed from some grand national strategy. It was shaped by real people, delegates, aides, consular staff, who boarded flights, read cables under flickering light, and sat for hours through sessions filled with political jargon trying to decode where their country stood in the global shuffle. You're sitting with one such figure now. Picture a former Iranian envoy in the 1970s living quietly in France. He wears thick glasses, his Persian French is still eloquent, and when asked about the 1947 vote, he doesn't smile. "We did what we were told," he says softly, "but no one told us why." This is where things get interesting, because as historians dig deeper, they occasionally uncover scraps, interview, transcripts, letters, marginalia, revealing that Iran's UN team at the time didn't receive clear ideological guidance. In fact, in several accounts, The Iranian delegation seemed surprised, even unsettled, by the decision they were instructed to carry out. One former staffer remembered asking a superior in New York, "Are we supporting a homeland or an empire?" The reply, a shrug. "We are supporting quiet." This isn't how most people imagine diplomacy: grand speeches, ringing declarations. But often it's more like filling out forms in triplicate while trying not to offend anyone powerful. Iran's diplomats trained in etiquette and ambiguity were well suited for that style. But the partition vote broke the mold. It demanded a decision. And in that moment, Iran's answer reflected less a vision than a calculation. Historians still debate who exactly inside Iran's power structure delivered the final order. Was it a close advisor of the Shah hoping to impress American contacts? Was it the foreign minister himself reading between lines in a telegram from Washington? Or was it simply the result of muddled internal communication, where no one wanted to be the one to say no to the Americans? What we do know is that after the vote, most of the diplomats involved slipped back into anonymity. They didn't give speeches, they weren't celebrated, they weren't punished either, just absorbed back into the quiet machinery of the state. There's a little-known story about an Iranian official who returned from New York in early 1948 and was asked by a colleague, "So we voted yes." He reportedly nodded, poured himself a cup of tea, and said, "Yes, but let's not talk about it." That silence, the practiced art of non-explanation, defined much of Iran's foreign policy at the time. Still, not all voices stayed silent forever. In the 1980s, a retired ambassador, let's call him Mr. R, gave a rare interview to a Persian-language newspaper in Europe. In it, he said the 1947 vote was a gesture made with crossed fingers. He claimed the delegation had been told to support the resolution if it appeared likely to pass, but not to draw attention to themselves. "We were a whisper," he said, "a whisper in a room full of thunder." Another diplomat interviewed decades later by a scholar in exile recalled how awkward it felt to be congratulated by members of the Jewish agency in the hallway after the vote. "We didn't celebrate," he said. "We simply nodded, then left the building." He added, "No one in Tehran asked me about it afterward. It was as if it had never happened." You lean back now imagining the weight these men carried, not because of what they said, but because of how little they said afterward. In diplomacy, sometimes silence speaks louder than the words, and there's something deeply human in that silence, in the avoidance, in the effort to compartmentalize an act that would later clash with the direction Iran's politics would take. Remember, the Islamic Revolution was only 3 decades away. Ayatollah Khomeini would soon declare Israel the enemy of Islam. Iranian streets would echo with slogans of resistance, but in 1947 it was all quieter. The vote was a ripple, not yet a wave. And yet these forgotten diplomats carried the knowledge that they had, however briefly, taken a different path. A gesture had been made. A hand, however shakily, had been extended. You're walking now through a university archive, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above you. In a box labeled UN Files 1947, you find a brittle folder. Inside there's a typed summary of Iran's position on the Palestine vote. It's short. 1 page, double-spaced, polite. It reads, "In the interest of regional stability and international cooperation, the delegation of Iran supports the partition resolution." That's it. No elaboration, no emotional language, just the same blend of diplomacy and caution that had characterized the vote itself. Historians still wonder what might have happened if Iran had said no. Would it have changed the outcome? Likely not. But it would have put Iran more firmly in the camp of Arab opposition, potentially aligning it more closely with Cairo, Damascus, and Riyadh. Instead, Iran chose neither full embrace nor outright rejection, just a nod, a whisper. And it is that whisper that still confuses observers today. Not because it was loud, but because it ever happened at all. Now you're standing in a moment of reversal, a pivot point that comes not with fanfare, but with the slow tightening of expressions and the quiet unspooling of a single syllable. Iran had voted yes, and yet within months it was already stepping back. Not with apologies, not with denial, But with the familiar rhythm of diplomatic retreat, the shift begins subtly. Tehran's official press grows quieter. Statements about cooperation are replaced by cautious phrases like ongoing developments in the Holy Land. Iranian diplomats, once at ease with their yes, now begin to duck questions. At international forums, Iran no longer mentions the vote. It becomes the elephant in the room that everyone sees but no one names. Historians still debate exactly what triggered Iran's sudden change in tone. Was it the explosion of violence in Palestine after the vote, the assassination of the UN mediator Count Volker Bernadotte in 1948, or simply the growing roar of the Arab world whose rejection of Israel's creation was becoming not only political but cultural, ideological and deeply emotional? You now find yourself in the audience of a small, government-sponsored lecture at Tehran University in early 1948. A professor of political science is speaking cautiously about regional alignment. His chalk squeaks as he writes, "national interests, ideological commitments." He circles the phrase twice. The students listen silent. They know the rules, talk carefully, ask nothing controversial, and never imply that the monarchy is improvising. At the same time, inside the Shah's court pressure is mounting. Advisors warn that the clerics are unhappy. Conservative newspapers, which had dared not criticize the vote when it was fresh, now begin running more aggressive op-eds. They never name the decision directly, but they criticize blind alignment with Western designs and a disregard for the Muslim Ummah. Everyone knows what they're referring to. And then there's Palestine itself. The dream of two peaceful states never materializes. War erupts almost instantly after the partition vote. Arab armies invade, Jewish militias mobilize, villages are emptied, refugees pour across borders. In Tehran, radio reports from Cairo and Baghdad grow angrier by the day. The streets begin to echo. People start asking, why did we support this again? You pass through a prayer hall in Qom. The air is heavy with incense and murmured regrets. A young seminarian copies out a letter from his teacher, one that will be circulated quietly among clerical networks. It says, "A government that forgets its duty to the faithful will answer not only to the people but to God." That might sound vague, but in Iran, vagueness is often sharper than any sword. Meanwhile, the Shah himself becomes increasingly cautious. He says nothing publicly about the new Jewish state. He receives no Zionist delegations. He sends no congratulatory cables. Iran doesn't open an embassy in Israel. It doesn't even send a trade representative. It simply looks the other way. Historians still puzzle over this diplomatic ghosting. Iran had said yes, but now pretended not to know the question. Some argue that the vote was a short-term gamble meant to buy time with the West with no long-term commitment. Others suggest it was a test balloon, an experiment in strategic alignment that quickly proved too costly. But there's also the possibility of fear. Fear of domestic unrest, fear of alienating Arab allies, fear of becoming isolated in a region where pro-Palestinian sentiment was rising like a tide. You can't forget that Iran, while Persian and not Arab, shared many cultural and religious affinities with its neighbors. Being the odd one out could be dangerous. You walk past a small bookshop in central Tehran where copies of Al-Ahram, An-Nahar, and Al-Quds, Al-Arabi are displayed next to local Persian dailies. Their headlines scream about Zionist violence, Arab martyrs, and betrayal. A teenage boy flips through the pages with tight brows. His eyes scan the print. He doesn't know yet that in 30 years he may march in protests under Khomeini's banners, shouting against the same monarchy that voted yes in silence. By the early 1950s, Iran's official stance had morphed into something almost oppositional. Not outright rejection of Israel's existence, but strong support for the Palestinian cause. Iranian representatives at the UN began criticizing Israeli actions more openly. The government courted Arab nations. Tehran even hosted delegations that publicly condemned Zionism. That original vote, forgotten by many, buried beneath newer headlines. There's a fringe but fascinating story that in 1951, when Mohammad Mossadegh rose to power and nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, some Israeli officials tried to reach out, offering technical support, oil expertise, even secret assistance. Mossadegh's reply, reportedly polite but firm, Our priorities lie elsewhere. The channel closed, another door that would not open again. You stand in a quiet hallway at the Iranian Foreign Ministry in 1952, where portraits of past envoys hang with stern expressions. A new generation of diplomats walks those floors, now nationalist, wary of the West, emboldened by Mossadegh's defiance. Ask them about the 1947 vote, and most will either deny involvement or deflect with elegant phrasing that was another time. Under other circumstances, with other goals, the reversal is nearly complete. Iran no longer acts like a supporter of the Jewish state. It is not yet its enemy, but it has stepped back from whatever brief warmth once existed. The vote is treated like an old telegram read, once folded twice, and filed away in a drawer labeled inconvenient history. And you walk quietly beside that drawer now. You open it just a little, feeling the weight of forgotten choices. And for a moment you understand nations, like people, often say things they later pretend they didn't. And history, patient and curious, waits for someone to remember. The years are now slipping past you more quickly like sand through the folds of a silk robe. You're no longer in the Iran of 1947 or 1948, where caution was currency and silence was strategy. You're in the Iran of the mid-1950s, now a different place, shaped by new tensions, louder voices and deeper divides. And the country's quiet yes to Israel in 1947 is no longer a decision, it's a historical inconvenience. By this time, the global context has shifted. The Cold War is in full swing. Mossadegh has come and gone, toppled in a 1953 coup widely believed to be orchestrated by the CIA and MI6 after he dared to nationalize British oil assets. The Shah is back on the throne with renewed American backing, and Iran is drifting ever more into the Western orbit, even as it tries to speak the language of post-colonial nationalism. But even within this new pro-Western framework, the idea of a warm relationship with Israel becomes increasingly untenable. The Arab world is not only angry, it's organizing. Pan-Arabism is rising. Gamal Abdel Nasser is emerging as a charismatic force in Egypt, championing Arab unity and anti-Zionist ideology. Tehran is watching carefully, nervously, trying to balance allegiances without slipping into isolation. So now comes the final part of the dance, the full disavowal. Not a theatrical rejection, not yet. That would come later, after the 1979 revolution, but a methodical distancing, step by step, statement by statement, gesture by calculated gesture. Historians still argue how deliberate this shift was. Did Iran really mean to erase its vote? Or did it just happen slowly, like a forgotten photograph fading in sunlight? You're sitting in a foreign ministry archive room in 1956. A clerk rifles through files looking for a copy of the UN voting record. When he finally finds the line where Iran supported the 1947 partition plan, he raises an eyebrow, mutters something like strange, and slips it back into the folder without a word. Even among officials, the vote has become a footnote best left unfootnoted. Outwardly, Iran begins to embrace more explicitly pro-Arab rhetoric. The country doesn't renounce the state of Israel, but its public statements increasingly emphasize the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. In international forums, Iranian diplomats vote in support of resolutions critical of Israeli military actions. Iranian newspapers start publishing articles condemning Zionist aggression. No one mentions the vote anymore, not in speeches, not in textbooks, not even in private. And yet behind the scenes, things are still complicated. Iran does not entirely sever contact with Israel. In fact, by the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Iran and Israel develop a discreet, under-the-table relationship, quiet trade, occasional intelligence sharing, mutual concerns about Arab nationalism. It's the diplomatic version of nodding at someone across a crowded room, but pretending not to know them when others are watching. There's a wonderfully strange fringe story from the 1960s. An Israeli agricultural expert is invited unofficially to advise on desert irrigation in southern Iran. He arrives under a false identity, works for 6 months, then vanishes again without ceremony. No documents bear his real name, no photograph was ever published, but the saplings he helped plant still grow. You now walk through one of those groves, date palms swaying gently in the southern breeze, and wonder how many other secrets are rooted here. How many votes cast, handshakes made, and wires tapped went unrecorded. Iran's relationship with Israel, even after the public disavowal, was a long, tense whisper of a thing neither admitted nor denied, like so much in geopolitics. And the public, they barely remembered. By the 1960s, the average Iranian on the street had more pressing concerns: economic growth, modernization, the Shah's white revolution, censorship, surveillance. The events of 1947 were fading into the background, eclipsed by louder, more current dramas. Palestine remained a cause, yes. The clerics kept the issue alive in sermons, the students marched with placards, but few connected it back to Iran's original yes. You're back now in a lecture hall in Shiraz. A young professor is giving a talk on Middle Eastern diplomacy. He outlines the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict with impressive detail. But when a student raises a hand and asks, "What did Iran do in 1947?" the professor pauses, glances at the clock, and simply says, "Iran has always supported justice for Palestine." The moment passes, the lecture resumes. This is how reversals happen. Not in screams, but in sighs, not in official retractions, but in studied omissions. The reversal of Iran's position on Israel didn't come with one dramatic press conference. It came through the erasure of a line from the national story, through rewritten schoolbooks, through editorial policies that instructed avoid past statements on this topic. And yet in the back rooms of policy discussions, the past still lingered. Intelligence officials remembered the brief coordination. Military analysts remembered the quiet cooperation, but even they wouldn't talk about it openly. The Shah, for his part, avoided the subject almost entirely. Publicly, he leaned into Arab-friendly rhetoric. Privately, he welcomed Israeli technology and know-how, especially in agriculture and security. Historians still wonder what the Shah really thought, whether he regretted the vote or simply saw it as a tool that had outlived its usefulness. He was never one to dwell. His regime, like so many in the region, was focused on the next crisis, the next alliance, the next economic plan. Dwelling on a vote cast in a distant hall in a language half the population didn't speak held no value. You leave the halls of power now and walk again through the streets. It's late. The tea houses are closing. The city breathes differently at night, slower, older, more honest. And in one of these corners, you imagine a man reading an old newspaper clipping from 1947. He sets it down, stares at it for a moment and mutters, "So we said yes." And now the haze of memory clears just enough for you to glimpse the weight of legacy. We're no longer crawling through telegrams or glancing side-eyed at dusty memoirs. We're standing in the long shadow of a decision, a whisper that rippled out into decades of thunder. That 1947 yes vote didn't change the world overnight. It didn't redraw borders with the sweep of a pen. But in the archives of international memory, it became a curious stone in Iran's diplomatic path, a soft yes that stood in contrast to the roar of later decades. Because after all the backpedaling, all the silence, all the careful omission, the fact remains, Iran once voted to create the very country it would later swear to oppose. And that's where things get strange. You're in the 1970s now. The Shah is riding high, or at least pretending to. Iran is flush with oil money, modernizing at warp speed and positioning itself as a regional power. But even in this golden facade, the Israeli question remains a quiet fault line. Officially, relations are non-existent. Unofficially, well, there are whispers of cooperation, shared intelligence on Arab military buildup, and shipments of Iranian oil making their way to Haifa through a secret pipeline. It's the most awkward sort of affair, hidden, unacknowledged, but mutually beneficial. Neither side admits it, but both keep the door slightly ajar. The Shah wants access to Israeli technology. Israel wants another Muslim-majority country, even a quiet one, to not be entirely hostile. The ghosts of 1947 nod in the background, but then 1979 happens. The monarchy collapses, the streets explode with revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini returns from exile and turns the country upside down, and with him comes a complete vocal, irreversible rupture with Israel. Iran is no longer silent. It is loud, furious, uncompromising. The new Islamic Republic calls Israel the little Satan, refuses to recognize its right to exist, and champions the Palestinian cause with unprecedented zeal. Embassies are handed over to the PLO. Street names are changed to honor Palestinian martyrs. Anti-Zionist rhetoric becomes state doctrine. Historians still debate how sincere Khomeini's stance was versus how much it was a convenient symbolic position for galvanizing popular support. But either way, the change is total. Iran doesn't just walk back its 1947 yes, it runs from it, buries it, sets the file cabinet on fire and throws the ashes into the Caspian. And yet, the record remains. Iran's name is still on that UN voting roll from November 29, 1947. The yes is still there, fixed in the amber of international proceedings. It can't be erased, not by revolution, not by rhetoric, not even by time. That one moment of alignment, however brief and half-hearted, is part of the story now. You now find yourself in a university seminar in modern-day Iran where a student raises a trembling hand and asks, "Did we really vote for Israel's creation?" The professor pauses, looks down, then says it was a different time, that's all. The discussion moves on. But that different time is worth sitting with, isn't it? Because for one strange flickering moment in the late 1940s, Iran was not the antagonist in Israel's story. It was not the voice of opposition. It was not yet drawn into the deep, enduring conflict that would come to define regional politics. It was simply a country trying to find its footing, torn between empire and independence, east and west, survival and principle. And that one vote was part of the attempt. You wander the corridors of memory a bit longer now, touching walls that feel like polished stone. In one niche, there's a yellowed copy of the UN resolution, framed and forgotten. Iran's yes is printed clearly sandwiched between Haiti and Iceland. No asterisk, no footnote. Just the name and the answer. That's the strange power of bureaucracy, isn't it? Even the most cautious gesture becomes permanent once recorded, and no amount of future shouting can make that paper unsign itself. You step outside again, into the streets of present-day Tehran. The murals are defiant, the flags wave proudly, the slogans are sharp. But beneath all that, the soil still holds older memories, older gestures, one of which was a simple word said once, long ago, in a very different world. A word that still echoes, if only faintly. The breeze is softer now. You feel it in the way Tehran's lanterns glow a little dimmer, the call to prayer blending with the honking of late-night taxis and the crackle of a radio somewhere behind a curtain. The story has circled in on itself, not as a neat ending, but as a long exhale, because this is where all roads in this tale converge today, the Iran you know and the Israel it once helped to create. You stand here in the contradiction, feet firmly planted in the present, looking backward across a strange, tangled bridge. What began as a pragmatic, whispered yes in 1947 has transformed into a public, thunderous no. The kind of no that echoes in UN votes, in Friday sermons, in the graffiti sprayed across embassy gates. But how did we get from there to here? How did Iran go from backing Israel's existence to funding Hezbollah, hosting Holocaust denial conferences and placing Tel Aviv firmly within its crosshair? It's not just revolution, it's not just ideology, it's identity. You see that vote, silent and calculated as it was, spoke to a version of Iran that no longer exists. The Iran of monarchy and marble columns of French-educated ministers and cautious courtly whispers. That Iran voted yes, not out of love or solidarity, but out of strategy. And once that strategy failed to yield the desired fruit, once it brought more confusion than benefit, the story began to rot from the inside. Historians still argue whether Iran's post-revolution hostility to Israel was inevitable. Some say it was a reaction to the Shah's secret cooperation with the Zionist state, a dramatic reversal meant to purge the past. Others believe it came from genuine religious conviction that the Islamic Republic truly sees Zionism as incompatible with the teachings of Islam and the justice owed to Palestinians. But there's also another layer, practical politics. Opposing Israel gives Iran leverage in the Arab world. It earns the support of militias, popular movements, and disaffected communities. It gives Tehran the appearance of revolutionary leadership. In a region where many governments have gradually opened up to Tel Aviv, Iran stands apart alone, loud and unwavering. And yet in doing so, it's as if that yes, in 1947 never happened. You're in the archives again, this time digitally. The page loads slowly. The document appears. UN Resolution 181, the partition plan. The voting record scrolls before your eyes. You look for Iran. There it is, still listed among the 33 nations who voted in favor. No footnote, no update. Just a permanent historical artifact. And now you realize something: Iran can rewrite textbooks. It can bury press clippings, revoke passports, and repaint history's murals. But it cannot erase a vote recorded by the United Nations. That yes lives outside its reach. A time capsule sealed by the very bureaucracy it once sought to navigate. You imagine a student in Tel Aviv stumbling across that list and blinking at the name Iran. Or a journalist in Tehran wondering if they're even allowed to mention it. The story is so buried that it's become almost mythic. Some people deny it outright, others whisper about it like a rumor. There's even a small, obscure academic paper published in the 2000s by an Iranian historian in exile titled "The Vote We Forgot." In it, he writes, "Perhaps the greatest tragedy of Iran's yes vote is not that it was later rejected, but that it was never understood to begin with." And you sit with that line for a while, letting it settle. Because maybe that's the true story here, not betrayal or reversal, but a gesture lost in translation, a vote made with unclear intentions in a room of shifting alliances under the gaze of empires and empires-to-be. It didn't define Iran, it didn't define Israel, but it left a mark, like a fingerprint smudged on a window pane, faint but real. And now, more than 75 years later, that mark remains. Not in headlines, not in slogans, but in the quiet, forgotten places where history hides its surprises. So here you are at the edge of the story, listening not for noise but for the original whisper, the one that said yes. And now you've walked the long path. You've wandered through dusty archives and candlelit corridors, sat beside diplomats and watched the flicker of old film reels. You've seen a single vote travel across time, morphing, muting, magnifying. Let it all soften now. Let the noise of the present ease into the hush of the past. The slogans, the conflicts, the rhetoric, they can all wait until morning. Right now, there's just the gentle hum of memory, like a distant radio playing songs you don't quite recognize. Imagine yourself back in that UN hall. The chairs are empty now, the microphones are silent, but the votes still sit there quietly recorded. Iran's yes glows faintly on the page, a small ember flickering in a sea of forgotten moments. You sit in that stillness for a while, no judgment, no urgency, just the weight of knowing. History doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers once and never again. But if you're listening closely enough, you can still hear it. Like the echo of a door gently closing. Like the creak of a chair in an empty room. Like a diplomat clearing his throat before saying the word yes, just once, before returning to silence.
And that's where we leave it tonight.
You've walked the quiet corridors of forgotten decisions, held your breath through the weight of memory, and returned safely with something small but precious understanding. Now let your thoughts grow soft. Let the hum of sleep wrap gently around you like a silk shawl. And when the dreams come, may they be gentle, may they be kind,